it is not only appropriate, but it is required of us as Christians to bring up our children in the faith of Jesus of Nazareth, in the fear of Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Nothing could be plainer for Christians. But this is not a universally held conviction. In commenting on psychologist Nicholas Humphrey's introductory comments to his amnesty lecture in Oxford in 1997, British professor and biologist Richard Dawkins, in his book The God Delusion, has written the following: "Children have a right not to have their minds addled by nonsense, and we as a society have a duty to protect them from it. So we should no more allow parents to teach their children to believe, for example, in the literal truth of the Bible, or that the planets rule their lives, than we should allow parents to knock their children's teeth out or lock them in a dungeon. Of course, such a strong statement needs and received much qualification. Isn't it a matter of opinion what is nonsense? Hasn't the apple cart of orthodox science been upset often enough to chasten us into caution? Scientists may think it's nonsense to teach astrology and the literal truth of the Bible, but there are others who think the opposite, and aren't they entitled to teach it to their children? Isn't it just as arrogant to insist that children should be taught science? I thank my own parents for taking the view that children should be taught not so much what to think, as how to think." That's the end of the quotation. Now, I realize that there is a lot to explore in what Dawkins has suggested, and I also realize that as Christians, some of us here might experience somewhat visceral reactions to his words. However, if we can find a way to set aside the sharpness of his tone, we might admit that we Christians share his concern to a degree. When parents raise their children, for example, to hate or even to kill other children, which happens in the world, I certainly have difficulty dividing that sort of an upbringing from child abuse. When parents raise their children to believe that they are superior to others or that they're entitled to more than someone else, I weep for those children too. So for those like Dawkins who believe Christian teaching to amount to a hill of rubbish, who can blame him for being concerned that we're raising our kids to believe it is the truth? Even more, though, I want to caution us this morning that we shouldn't let the aggressiveness of Dawkins's words deafen us to an even more subtle critique that we might need to hear as Christians. There is a criticism of the religious that Dawkins and others of his opinion have raised that I've found valuable in my own practice of Christian parenting. It's this: there is a distinction to be made between raising Christian children and raising children to choose to follow Jesus. There's an old saying in the traditions of Wesleyan theology, in which I was raised, which confesses that God does not have grandchildren, only sons and daughters. Perhaps that saying needs to influence the way we bring up our children as Christians. In addressing these and similar concerns today, we're going to turn briefly to the First Testament book of Deuteronomy chapter 6, and I'm going to begin reading in verse 4. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates." It's hard to overstate the importance of these verses both to Judaism and to Christianity. These words are among the first that Jewish children learn to recite. These words are the foundation for the Jewish and Christian claims that there is only one God, and these words continue to shape what it means to raise our children in the fear of Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who became flesh in the person of Jesus. Of primary interest to me today, as I've already indicated, is not the question of whether we should raise our children in the context of our Christian faith. Of course we should. We hardly need to do any more than simply read Deuteronomy chapter 6 verses 4 through 9 to appreciate that responsibility. Instead, my interest is in exploring how God commanded the Israelites to deliver his teachings to their children, whether we're speaking of biological children or adopted children or even spiritual children in the faith. Deuteronomy 6:4 says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." In verse 5, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." It seems important to recognize that according to the agreement that God made with the Israelites at Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus, Israelite children did not become responsible to obey the law comprehensively until they reached an age of accountability. Eventually, that age was set around 12 or 13 years of age, and at that age, a male child would make his first sacrifice and commit himself to walk in the ways delineated by the covenant of Sinai personally. If he would not, then he would be put out of Israel. So these words are spoken to those considered old enough to be responsible under the law, and it is to them that Moses said, "Love the Lord your God with all your deciding, and with all your being, and with all your doing." The instruction to love God is not one given primarily to children who have not yet come of age. It's given to adults, to those who have chosen to submit themselves to the covenant, to the agreement of God. The raising of children in godly homes begins with the parents' love of God. Let's allow that thought to settle on us. The raising of our children with respect to Christian faith begins not with them, but with us. We are to testify before them our love for God, and it's not a love we can necessarily impose on them. They'll have to choose to love the Lord themselves. What God has asked is that their first exposure to the love of God be the love for God they have witnessed in us. Continue with me as I pick up reading in verse 7. "Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up." The word translated impress here is a Hebrew word that means to repeat over and over again, and to do it so intensively that it becomes a form of teaching. The exhortation is to repeat the instructions of God to our children without ceasing, when we're at home and when we're traveling, from the moment we rise in the morning to when we lie down in the evening. We're to evidence our love of God before our children by making the Word of God a mainstay of our conversation. Now, this command is not a command to simply speak of God all the time. No, it's an exhortation specifically to repeat the words God has spoken. This assumes the discussion of Torah originally, and for us who live in the wake of the ministry of Jesus, it assumes the discussion of the entirety of the First and New Testaments. Continue following along as I pick up reading in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 8. "Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates." Now, it is true that some segments of Jewish culture have taken these words quite literally, placing boxes on their hands and foreheads and inserting small scrolls of the law of Moses into boxes within the doorframes of their houses. However, I'm in agreement with those who believe that Moses' words here were intended to be somewhat metaphorical. The hand is the instrument of doing, and instead of forehead, the Hebrew literally says between the eyes. And the eyes are the instruments of seeing, and something placed between them would determine our direction. The doors of houses were places of decision-making in the home, and the gates of cities were the places of decision-making for the larger communities at the time. So I think the exhortation here for Moses was that parents evidence faithfulness to Torah with the entirety of their lives, that is, to the covenant God made with them at Mount Sinai. The instruction of God was to guide their hands in all that they did, was to guide their decision-making and the way in which they directed their life. It was to be the foundational concern in all the decisions that they made, both in their homes and in the larger communities. The commands of God for passing on the faith of parents to their children included three overarching components, and they are these: confession, repetition, and performance. Israelite parents were to prepare their children for the choice to submit themselves to the will and way of God by confessing their own love for God with their entire lives, that is, without pretending or hypocrisy, by repeating the words of God whenever and wherever they were, so they were to be students of the Word, and by living out the instructions of God in every area of their lives, so they were to be consistent in their faith and transparent with it. parents were to make a case for the faithfulness and trustworthiness of God with their very lives, with all their heart, self, and strength. And ideally, children would learn who God is and what God wants simply by living with their parents and watching their example. Children would learn to trust God by experiencing His faithfulness to their parents. The next generation would come to trust the tradition of their parents not by compulsion or manipulation or even by indoctrination, but by experiencing the truth of these traditions themselves as they observe the consistent witness of their parents. What I think Dawkins might remind us of if we're willing, and the Bible seems to teach consistently in my reading, is that God does not have grandchildren. In other words, Christian faith is not a family heirloom to be passed down or an inheritance to be received. All of us are not born into the family of God. We are adopted into it by faith. Christian faith is a choice that each generation must make anew. And it's the responsibility of those who are parents and spiritual mentors to provide such a life testimony before the next generation, so that those who follow after us will not be able to make their ultimate decision of faith without reference to the lives they have lived with us. No matter how good our intentions, there is very little value in trying to force our children into decisions they are not yet ready to make, or to require faith of them that they do not presently possess. God has graced each generation a measure of free will. Now, that's not to say that parents shouldn't correct children or discipline them. Parents must, of course, require children either to live out the morality we have learned from Jesus or to face appropriate consequences. However, requiring moral and ethical behavior dependent upon our faith in Jesus and trying to require faith in God are very different aspirations. Understood in this way, I think I can affirm with Dawkins that the commitment of Christian parents should be less concerned with forcing or compelling our children to think this or to think that. Instead, we must demonstrate before them the consistency and thoroughgoingness of our convictions, and require only that they walk with us on the road we have chosen until they come of age to choose the road they will walk for themselves. And if we are to hear Deuteronomy adequately today, we must embrace the call to show them everything. They must hear our doubts as well as our certainties. We must invite them into our decision-making processes, and not just to hear our conclusions. We must encourage them to encounter and even to consider thoughts and ideas with which we don't agree, and explain to them why we have come to the conclusions to which we have come. We must be as committed to the free will of our children as God has proven to be to our own, and only then will the next generation have the information God wishes them to have to make a decision of faith. God has not asked any of us to believe blindly. God asked Israel originally, and all nations eventually, to trust Him. He asked Israel to root their trust in His deliverance of them from Egypt. And He has asked all of us to root our trust in Him in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But trust cannot be forced, nor can it be inherited or bequeathed. True trust must be earned, it must be tested, and it must be chosen and proven true. So the question for all of us who might be tasked with the responsibilities of parenting is, are we raising our children to choose Jesus, or are we raising them simply to be Christians? It is at this point that Christianity should be distinguished from most other religions, but sadly, it often is not. We are tasked with raising individuals with the hope of assisting them in making a choice that in the end only they can make. But we cannot guarantee the choice they'll make, nor should we try to guarantee it. If we want them to know Jesus as we have come to know Him, as laudable as that goal is, we're doomed to failure. Why? Because none of us knows Jesus precisely as another does. Each of our stories is unique, and each of our roads to God, as communally driven as they may be, are quite personal. Our hope must not be that our children know Jesus precisely as we know Him, but that they are encountered by Him themselves. Our great temptation, as parents and even as mentors, is to try to do for our children what they can in reality only do for themselves. As Christians, we're not raising our children to believe something. but rather we are raising them to prepare to choose with respect to someone. And that should influence how we raise them and how we live before them. May it be so.